Welcome back to Intelligence Spotlight, where we speak to the people across security, journalism, open source intelligence, information integrity, and the changing nature of the world. We're living through a moment where information itself has become contested terrain. What people see, trust, and share can shape public opinion, influence conflict, affect democratic debate, and in some cases put lives at risk. But behind the big terms, disinformation, AI, hostile influence, and information warfare, there are also difficult questions about responsibility. What does ethical journalism look like when speed often comes before accuracy? How do we verify information without losing the human story behind it? How do democratic societies protect themselves without undermining the freedom they claim to defend? Today, we will explore those questions through the work and journey of someone who has worked closely with journalists, open source investigators, and organizations trying to strengthen the integrity of the information space. My guest today is Olivia Pirie-Griffiths. Olivia has worked in journalism, press freedom, and information integrity, including with the Center for Information Resilience, where she worked on partnerships, impact, and engagement around some of the most difficult information environments in the world. Her work has involved supporting journalism, working with open source evidence, and thinking critically about how information could be used responsibly, especially in contexts where access is limited, reporting is dangerous, and reliable information is often under pressure. She is now studying national security studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, bringing together her experience in journalism and information integrity with wider questions around conflict, democracy, security, and resilience. Olivia, thank you so much for joining me on the Intelligence Spotlight. It's great to have you here.
Qais, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Olivia, so I tried to introduce you as much as I could, but what did I miss not telling our audience about your background?
What did you miss? That's a good question. I mean, obviously, a lot goes into making up a person and the background of their professional life. I suppose actually the foundational point is that my background's in philosophy, and that sort of interest in trust and what builds our democracies and what holds them together is sort of the foundation for how my career has developed over the last decade.
Olivia, you recently worked at Afghan Witness project of the Center for Information Resilience, and part of the work was also documenting violations, but also working with Afghan journalists, diaspora communities, and women-focused media organizations to strengthen the reporting and their ability to be more resilient at a time when they were in exile, but also trying to report on the country. Before you were working in this space professionally, where did your own interests in journalism and the whole information environment first came that you were like, I want to work in this field. This is something that interests me and that I could be part of it?
That's an interesting question. I do remember it. In some ways it was gradual, but there was also a moment as well. There was sort of a gradual development, but also a moment as well. And that gradual development came from that, the study that I did in that area, then leading me to think that the most useful place for my career to take me would probably be towards climate change and trying to, support organizations and governments with policy and things like that in that area. But then you and some of your audience might remember a journalist called Peter Grester was imprisoned in Egypt, in Cairo in 2013. He was a journalist, a Latvian-Australian journalist who was working for Al Jazeera at the time, and he was accused of terrorism purely for doing a journalist's job of trying to report both sides of the story. And when he was stuck in jail for 400 days.
Wow.
It was, a global story. When he finally was released and came back to Australia, he founded an organization called the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. I realized that actually press freedom work and working in the information environment is more effective in terms of what I wanted to achieve with the, path that I thought I was taking with climate change. Because I realized at that point that if we don't have systems of information in our democracies that we can trust, then we can't actually solve any issues.
It seems like you already had a vision to help the world in a way. Working in climate change is one thing, but also working on the building trust in society is another thing. But for me, it's also interesting that you worked closely with the whole media space of a country, Afghanistan, which is a good example of how quickly uh, journalism could also become a security issue in a country like Afghanistan. Since 2021, restriction on media, intimidation, and even limited access to information was something that became quite limited, and independent reporting was also much harder, especially for women journalists in that space. And most of them were working from exile. And you've been part of a network that worked with them closely. Was there a particular moment or experience or person that actually made you feel that this was not simply an academic interest or something that you would do on an everyday basis, but something you wanted to pursue professionally?
Not one moment, but my mother, Qais Pirie, was a brilliant editor in Australia, and she edited royal commissions and parliamentary inquiries that held those in Australia's democracy and democratic institutions to account. And I always really admired her work. Growing up in Canberra, in Australia, obviously it's the capital, and so but it's known as the bush capital for a reason. It's a little bit more relaxed than, say, your Washington, D.C.
Right.
And because of that, and because of its size, you actually sort of cross paths with the Prime Minister of the day when you're getting your morning coffee sometimes. And so I was always sort of surrounded by those sorts of political figures and figures in, in diplomacy and other sorts of areas whilst I was growing up. And I always found that environment interesting. But it was largely the inspiration from my mother's career and life. She also traveled extensively, and she really loved Afghanistan as well as a country. So I put it down to her.
Oh, um, that must have been also quite inspiring because this is the first time I'm also hearing an Intelligence Spotlight series that I guess mother was also a big inspiration in their lives and their career professionally, but also about the world in itself. I want to go back a bit in your early stages of your career and then working in this space. How did it look like when you just started in the field? And was it hard for you? Was it something that you were still exploring to know what you want to do? You've been all around working on various places. Now you're based in London. So, of course, I assume that you also had a quite interesting career stages in your life.
When I was 27, I became the executive director of the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, which again was that nascent press freedom organisation that Peter Grester founded in Australia to work in Australia and the Asia Pacific after he returned from prison. It was a huge step for me. Prior to that, had been working for a number of not-for-profit organisations, including the Ethics Centre, which is a centre for applied ethics, a bit similar to the School of Life, but more of a corporate focus, a consultancy focus, as mentioned. But the AJF executive director role was everything, so I was doing government relations, fundraising, policy, strategy, everything, marketing, events. So it was really overwhelming to begin with, but I was deeply fortunate because the three founders of that organization, Peter Wilkinson, Chris Flynn, and Peter Grester, supported me, pushed me, and helped me learn really quickly through, I guess, a baptism of fire.
It's something that I also deeply appreciate.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I've certainly, over the course of my career so far, I've experienced really wonderful leaders and I've experienced leaders who aren't as wonderful. It shouldn't have to be a privilege, but the benefit of having a good leader of an organization who is ethical and really understands how important that mentorship is it just makes all the difference for not only personal development, but it benefits the whole industry and the work that we all hope to do.
Exactly. Let's talk about your work with the Center for Information Resilience, which was quite important, and particularly through the project of Afghan Witness. What did you experience working with that organization actually teach you about strength and limitations of open source investigations overall?
It certainly did. So my work at CIR was quite varied. So beyond the Afghanistan work, which of course we worked on together, I also led a counter foreign interference project across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and also another smaller project in Angola, which was very interesting. And so I was working across different geographies, ones that I had not worked in before. So, there's inevitable learning that comes from that. And I also worked to build external partnerships and relationships for CIR globally.
Mhm.
So I learned a lot, and my work was focused across all those areas. But I think the main thing that I found and that I learned from my work at CIR was in our day-to-day work on Afghanistan. And I think working with my Afghan colleagues and with the Afghan diaspora week to week and day to day, and being able to collaborate with them on projects that we did together to support information integrity. The resounding sort of takeaway that I have from that was how important it is to work with those parties in country and in the diaspora of wherever it is that you might be working, rather than sort of applying a Western culture down approach, which is an awful phrase, but there's often an approach that implies a sense of superiority. And I think it's a deeply misguided notion that the West knows best. And I think I learned so much from that role because I was working so closely with Afghan, nationals and those in the diaspora and Afghan organizations. And I learned the most from them for sure. And it reminded me also that the best journalism and OSINT always happens collaboratively when, all perspectives and voices are heard.
Right, right. So I've got a question on that aspect. Do you think working internationally could teach us more about ourselves and our abilities and limitations, or working only on a particular country or particular project?
It depends. I think it depends what end you're seeking. I think there's infinite depth working internationally, obviously. There's also infinite depth working on one particular country. I spent 2.5 years working on Afghanistan, and I feel like I only just started to scratch the surface of that
Hmm.
country's history and the nuances and the complexities of the various relationships and, or the many relationships that we were sort of interacting with. So I think infinite depth is found in either. It just depends
Hmm.
what end you want to seek. For me, I don't necessarily want to be a country specialist. I'd rather be a specialist in the craft or the skills that I practice. So working internationally and across different geographies is of greater interest to me personally, but that doesn't mean there's any less depth in focusing just on one country itself.
Right, right. And among all of that, each country has its own information environment and how that information is processed and how trust is built in that society and how journalists are reporting from that country. But among our conversation, we use a lot the term information integrity, right? And information integrity, I'm sure for some of our audience might be what that means. They might have this question like, okay, information and integrity together, what does it mean? Could you maybe explain what the term in itself mean practically?
Yes, I'd love to. This is something I think a lot about. But I do just want to jump back briefly to a point that you mentioned there about different countries having different information environments.
Right.
I think I agree with that. It's certainly true. But it's also important to note that those information environments are always intersecting and shaping each other. So, the work that I did in Angola looked at the information
Mhm.
environment there. But what was really clear was that actually Brazil's information environment is a huge influence on Angola's information environment. And then,
Wow.
there are other connections beyond that. So it's all connected. And I think in defining information integrity, I actually think about it visually. I think information integrity is the strength and resilience of the systems of communication that
Mhm.
depict, explain, and challenge our democracies and societies. So I sort of see it as an interwoven web, I suppose.
Wow. I'm sure that needs to be think through again, because what you described is that we are no matter if we have different information environments, but at the same time, they're all so much connected that influence each other that could either inflame a society or together they might create a better world. There was this phrase, I was watching one of the vloggers who visited Afghanistan, and I'm sure this is a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, that the fact that they visit Afghanistan is also legitimizing a regime that is limiting the freedom of half of society, but also independent media, journalism. What she described was very interesting to me. She said that in Afghanistan, the information they're fed about the West is the extreme of the West. And what is fed in the Western society about Afghanistan is also the extreme of that, and how they're influencing each other, which they both are also saying that we have to not welcome them both ways, not welcome the Western freedom and not welcome the refugees in the West. So in both ways, they influence each other. And the example was quite interesting. The example was that what information, so she spoke to someone inside the country that told her about how women are naked in Manchester. And she was quite shocked. She was British as well. And she said, okay, that might be at a part of a society, but not everyone is walking like that or living like that. It's a different society. But she also said what being fed about Afghanistan and let's say in the UK for the general public is that this whole society is so extreme that they all are the same. They all are like the Taliban, which is also not true. So in both ways, influence is something not great in a way that doesn't bridge people at the same time. I think information environments could be the same in influencing each other in both ways, negatively but also positively. And this was something that actually I was thinking that how it's easy that even not just information, but also disinformation could also be used in these circumstances to influence political influence in these countries.
Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, it's even not so much about the disinformation all of those things are obviously directly relevant, but actually
Yeah,
I would even take it a step above to the tech platforms' lack of accountability for their own algorithms and how those
right.
algorithms change and shape and direct
Hmm.
opinions into sort of silos that are more and more extreme. We live in an attention economy.
Mm,
Those platforms profit from that attention. And now with the introduction of AI, we're moving, in the words of Tristan Harris from the Center for Humane Technology, we're moving into an attachment economy where
right.
actually we even have personal psychological attachments to these sorts of algorithms. So
Yeah,
I think the algorithms themselves are actually the key element there that pushes those sorts of extreme views, regardless of which way they go.
yeah.
And really, that's a question about tech platforms' accountability and national security and stability.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And on that part, also, I guess the work of fact checkers are important. But I think there's a difference between information integrity and fact checking, counter disinformation, or media literacy related work. And what is that difference, particularly?
So again, if I described information integrity as sort of this overarching web that describes the system of communication
Hmm.
that we have in our democracies and societies, I see fact checking, counter disinformation, media literacy, all of those elements as part of that system. Information
Hmm.
integrity is a broader, for want of a better word, more meta
I see.
concept. Yeah.
I see. Well, that's something I just learned. I actually never thought about it like that way, like as an overarching element that involves all of these aspects. And
Yeah.
I think a while ago we had a discussion on ethical journalism and OSINT as well, which is quite important. And at the time that you mentioned about the algorithms, how tech facilitated disinformation and also online harassment through disinformation could damage societies, damage reporting and also journalism in itself, particularly with AI materials today. It's so easy to generate them quickly and do stuff with automations as well. Like there are accounts that are automated through AI that pushing certain narratives. So what does ethical journalism mean to you, actually, at the time when attention is everything, which means that people should be fast enough to share something on social media and on news channels. Competition is so high on that side to push journalists to publish them quickly. Do you think that would undermine ethical journalism?
Yeah, it does. The failure of public interest journalism funding models and the rise of big tech and the rise of algorithms and the reticence of big tech companies to elevate ethical or good journalism and to instead inflame information that enrages for what we just discussed, the attachment or an attention economies. There is it's that sort of that need, all of those things contribute to journalism suffering and the integrity of journalism suffering. I think ethical journalism needs to be produced freely, without favor, and in an environment of accountability. So, of course, the concept of having no biases whatsoever is sort of moot in reality, because everyone has a different perspective in this world, and the same goes for journalists. But good journalists and good publishers should state those biases and, importantly, work to ensure that both sides of a story are represented equally, regardless of those biases, to enable, I think, the audience to make up their own mind. I think that ultimately should be the task and intention of good journalism.
Yeah, it also reminds me of this topic that I read the other day about how traditional journalism, dying, and how creator journalism is appearing. It is more and more favorable because of all these algorithms. Um, and a lot of media companies are laying off their employees at the same time. Do you think we are going through information crisis or traditional? I want to phrase this in a way that actually combines all of these terms together. Do you think we're living through a crisis in journalism or a transition in journalism?
I think we're living through both.
Wow.
I think it is a crisis for journalism, and inevitably a crisis requires transition if
Yeah.
you're going to keep an industry alive. So I think it's probably both. I think one of the sort of crucial areas here is that it's not just a crisis of journalism. Journalism doesn't sit on an island. It's a crisis of democratic institutions. It's a crisis for our democracies as a whole. And when we consider how to meet and respond to that crisis, it also needs to not just come from the journalism community. I think, the national security community needs to better realize how integral journalism is for the very societies those national security efforts seek to protect.
Yeah.
On the other hand as well, the journalistic community needs to do the same for the national security community, and the same with the legislature, and the same with governments or parliaments. So it's sort of a whole of democratic institutions response that's needed. But I think it is both a crisis and a transition.
Right. And also at the same time, journalists are also faced with a lot of pressure when it comes to reporting on very sensitive topics, particularly around graphic materials, incidents that involves human tragedies. So my question on that would be, when investigators come across these graphic materials, even sensitive identities or people who are underage or people who are part of vulnerable communities, could that put people at risk if not ethically reported, all aspects are considered? Or how should they decide what to publish and what to withhold, or unless the government forces them to do?
I think this is a really interesting question, Qais, because it's both an ethical and a legislative question. So ethically, it's a similar question to, I think, sort of what we've discussed considering sort of journalistic responsibility and ethical journalism. And of course, these things, context and potential harms need to be considered when deciding whether or not to publish something, or to what extent something should be published, of course, as I've mentioned, working collaboratively with the community that you are reporting within to understand the cultural nuances and, all of those relevant things.
Right.
But legislatively, both are of interest to me, but legislatively, and while I'm studying national security, this directly relates to the national security environment that you're publishing within. and that you're
Right.
reporting on. So it's very much dependent on how those national security laws interact with laws that protect the public's right to know if they
Yeah.
exist in the area that you're publishing. So there may be instances where publishing something is in fact only going to increase a security risk for people
Yeah.
involved or for the broader community. And in that particular security environment. So it's hugely important as a journalist and publisher to
Yeah.
understand those national security imperatives of wherever you're reporting and publishing from. And
Mm-hmm.
don't, I think journalists, again, it's back to that sort of, there is a necessary tension between the journalistic community and the national security community. But they
Right.
both also need to see each other's relevance and not
Mm-hmm.
see each other as, problems that they need to work around or avoid.
Right.
National security and journalism are inherently connected. So, sort of OSINTers, journalists, and anyone working in the information environment needs to understand the very real national security imperatives that relate to their work. And we all know those national security imperatives have increased in recent years and continue to increase. So, I think that's, a really important issue to touch on.
Yes, you combine both national security and journalism. While also interestingly, you worked in journalism and now you're studying national security at King's College London, and in a department that is first of its own in the world. Department of War Studies. Most people who have graduated from this department have done quite remarkable things. Working in
No pressure, guys.
very nice information places. That feels somehow natural to move there, but also a significant shift, right, from your working directly with journalism. So, what motivated you basically to return to academic study at this point in your career?
Well, I actually don't see those two areas as distinctly separate, actually.
Right.
So all of my press freedom work to date has been about how we thread the needle between the public's right to know and journalists' ability to do their jobs and the
Hmm.
national security imperatives that keep our democracy safe. So it's always been about understanding the dynamics between those two different elements and how they work together and how it's essential that they work together
Yeah.
to have a healthy democracy. Because if we have national security laws that, aren't accompanied by effective protections for the public's right to know,
Yeah.
then the national security laws end up stifling the democracy that they supposedly seek to, or that they do seek to protect in the first place. So, I don't for one second think that national security laws that are introduced in countries like Australia that I have experience with are not needed. But
Right.
what is needed is to ensure that, the freedoms and supports that we have for those freedoms in our legislative environment in those
Hmm.
countries exist as well. They need to exist together, or else we end up becoming like the societies that we're trying to protect ourselves from. So I don't really see my work in press freedom and my work in national security as sort of a departure or a distinct separation. I think they actually are inherently connected. And so the motivation really was to get a formal understanding of the national security environment. I've obviously
Hmm.
worked in that space in the ways I've described for a decade, but I've never studied national security. And, while I'm over on this side of the world, what a great opportunity to study at King's and at their Department of War Studies. So yeah, it's been a joy.
Yes, and on that, I'm sure you guys also have come across different digital acts and regulations across Europe or other countries that are particularly countermeasures to online disinformation and responding to that. And particularly since a couple of years, we see a rise in disinformation in Europe in many different areas when it comes to gender, when it comes to society, when it comes to every aspect of society. And I call this information as a danger to the fabric of the society. It creates an environment that is so hostile for people that actually undermines democracy in long term. So the question would be on how can governments respond seriously to disinformation, foreign influence, without using the language of national security to restrict legitimate journalism or criticism or freedom of expression?
So this is a question that someone could do a PhD on and spend their life looking at. But to answer briefly, you need to ensure that your legislative environments support national security and the public's right to know in tandem. That's sort of a repetitive answer because I mentioned that before. But, as I said, if we don't ensure that our national security infrastructure is sound and strong and responding to the issues that are increasing,
Right.
particularly issues in the information environment. I think national security laws have a way to go to ensure that, that area of national security is actually protected and considered effectively.
Across Europe, governments are trying to respond to disinformation, right, through measures such as EU's Digital Service Act, which also requires major platforms to assist and mitigate systemic risks. And despite that, still there are a lot of restrictions coming from the governments saying that, okay, this is the matter of national security, therefore this information is restricted. But also there was a good example about the UK where they needed to release a person's name who was underage, but due to the laws in the UK, you cannot release their name if they have done a criminal act and so on. But that led to riots in the UK. They wanted to know the identity of this person. Why? Because fake information was spreading about the identity of the person, and the UK government was forced to release the name of the person and the identity of that person. How can governments respond seriously to disinformation, right, in this space and foreign influence without using the language of national security and rather trying to connect with the society and building trust?
Well, I think so. I'm not aware of the example you just used, but in any detail, but I do think it sounds like a good example of why the national security agencies and the media need to work more collaboratively together while still retaining that necessary tension that should exist between them. I don't think governments need to avoid using national security language, actually. I think it's something that anyone who's part of a democracy should be aware of as a fundamental pillar of that democracy. So I wouldn't necessarily say that governments need to sort of describe it without
Right.
using national security language. But I do ultimately think it's again a question of those different pillars of a
Yeah.
democracy working together better. We've got a history in the last, well, certainly since 9/11 of national security laws, at least in Australia, but also in the UK as well, national security laws being introduced with good reason. But many of those laws have been introduced without adequate supports for the public's right to know and public freedoms and
Mhm.
journalists' ability to do their jobs in tandem with those laws. So I think, again, it's all about threading that needle between those democratic institutions. And at the moment, we haven't quite got the balance right.
Mhm.
The UK in some ways is doing slightly better than Australia, but in some ways Australia is also outstepping the UK there. So it's,
Mhm.
no one's got it perfectly right, but as long as we keep working on threading that needle and finding the right balance there, then I think it makes me feel hopeful that we'll get there.
Right. Olivia, I want to pose you two last questions. The last question you might not expect, but the question I want to pose to you is what gives you hope and confidence in journalism and information integrity, and whether it could survive all these attacks or risks that journalists are facing, or the information integrity in itself faces?
So I've been asked this question before, and as you were speaking then, I realized that my answer to it has changed a little bit. This part hasn't changed. So what gives me hope has always been and continues to be the amazing colleagues and people that we work with in this space. I do think it's really crucial now, though, that governments, security agencies, tech platforms or tech CEOs work closely together to make sure that the incredible progress and freedoms that we're seeing and developments that we're seeing through
Mhm.
these tech platforms, whether it be AI or just, other sorts of technological developments, we will continue to see our democratic systems be undermined. And
Hmm.
so I think security agencies from a national security perspective, governments from a political perspective, as well as a national security perspective, and frankly, from an economic resilience perspective, need to work better with tech platforms, and tech platforms need to work more productively with governments to make sure that we find the right balance there so that our societies are strengthened rather than weak in the process.
Right, right. If you could do time travel, when would you travel to? Where would you travel to? And what would you change?
This is really funny because I was watching a Ricky Gervais special last night and he has a joke about how everyone who gets asked this question says they would go back and murder a baby Hitler. But actually, his joke is that in reality, people would just go back to the 1990s and buy Microsoft shares. But I don't think I would do either of those things. What would I do? Where would I go back to? And what would I change? Hmm. There are so many things that you could do here. This is really unfair, guys.
All right. Then what would you change now if you could had a genie that could make your wishes come true?
So if I could go back to any time period, I would go back to 600 BC
Wow.
when Heraclitus, the Greek pre-Socratic philosopher, was kicking around.
Mm,
And he's who I studied for my philosophy honors. I would spend a day with him, or however long I was able to spend with him. So I would be in ancient Greece, probably Athens, in 600 BC. What would I change from that time? Nothing. I don't think I would change anything, if that's an okay answer to have, because I don't actually really agree with the idea of rewriting the past. I think that we need to meet the challenges that we have today, but I don't think there's much use in going back and trying to shift things that have already occurred. Because also, if I did change something, who knows, we might fast forward to a world that's far worse than what we are currently confronted by. So I think I would change nothing, and I'd go back there, I'd spend time with Heraclitus, and then I'd zip back to today and continue doing the work that I'm doing now.
right.
If you'll accept that answer.
I think that's a perfect answer. Sometimes you don't have to change anything. As you said, it might influence things that you never predicted. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us on the Intelligence Spotlight series, Olivia. It was great conversation with you and the summer of heat and with the flow of information that is unstoppable.
Guys, thanks so much for having me. It was a joy to speak about these things on Intel Focus.
Likewise, take care.
You too.